20.
Welcome to Garage Quest Episode 3, the show about the favorite game of every garage rocker since the 70s, Dungeons and Dragons. I'm your host from the Psychedelic Cherry. I'm May McDonough, and with me is my personal dungeon master, love of my life, Rusty. And today is a favorite episode because today we're talking about anarchy in D&D. Anarchy in Faerun, to be specific.
Anarchy in Faerun.
So, I wanted to talk about this because in a world where gods exist, where kingdoms exist, in a world where factions exist, in a world where almost everyone has sworn their allegiance to someone, what does anarchy look like? You know, it can exist. And what does it look like? What do characters who have anarchist leanings look like? Can it be organized? Can it not be organized? What are the enemies of anarchy in Faerun? So, what do you think? What does anarchy look like in 5e D&D?
Well, you already mentioned that, you know, Faerun in the 5e system of D&D, you know, is rife with factions.
Yeah.
You know, if you're not familiar with how factions work within a campaign setting, you might want to consider picking up the Princess of the Apocalypse Elemental Evil book. You know, obviously, you know, we're not here to promote or sell books or anything, but I love these books.
We're not making money.
No, no way, shape, and form. Probably losing it. But these bring me so much joy that, you know, you might consider giving it a try, too.
Yeah, I think all the official D&D books are absolute great reads.
In trying to, like, incorporate this kind of garage punk, you know, element into a D&D type or a D&D in, you know, campaign, world. You know, because, you know, face it, we spend a lot of time in the garage.
Yeah.
And, you know, art is a mimicry of life. What is that expression? Art imitates life.
Art imitates, yeah, it's that one.
Yeah, art imitates life, right? So.
And life imitates art.
Yeah, so if we're living a kind of like DIY punk rock anarchist kind of a lifestyle, then it's be natural for us to want to incorporate that into our fantasy role-playing experience from time to time.
Sure.
Most of this is probably going to get cut.
Well, okay, so we have a character that my brother plays.
Mm-hmm.
Scout.
Yeah.
And Scout is his character is basically one of the merry men.
Yeah, imagine a disillusioned member of Robin Hood's band of merry men.
Yeah. Yeah. So he hates the crown. He spent his life fighting against a particular royal element, and I think his backstory is that Robin Hood won, the merry men won, and then Robin Hood kind of became the oligarchy.
Yeah, you know, and the old absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Right. So Scout, this character, has moved on. But he still has what I would consider to be anarchist ideals.
Very much
within Faerun.
For the underdog, very much against the established authority. Definitely, you know, encourages people to think outside of a hierarchical societal structure and to challenge the notions of authority and what's right and what's wrong with respect to, you know, personal identity and destiny, you know?
Yeah, I think it's anarchy based on the morality of humanism as opposed to like prescribed moralities from allegiances.
Not to take this into an anarchist philosophy like discourse,
Sure.
but the way that anarchistic themes are woven into our epic mythos as a culture, I think demonstrate how anarchy really is a part of being human. But that is probably a topic for another discussion.
Yeah, if we this will end up being a lecture on cultural relativism if we go any further on that. But to get back to Scout, he functions as a hero. He's an adventurer in our group.
Yeah.
But he is, I don't know that he necessarily labels himself anarchist, but he definitely functions.
Do most anarchists? Okay.
Some definitely do. But you're getting into another conversation again. So I think in a world that is a lot more black and white than our world, just because there's an actual guidebook on a meta level determining things, anarchy is absolutely possible, but I think that it's going to look a little different than anarchy in our world, or it's going to look like more specific instances of anarchy in our world, because there's not necessarily a world government in Faerun. There's not necessarily even very large governments in Faerun. It's already a localized world. But nevertheless, on a smaller level, the injustices of government still exist. And therefore, anarchy can still exist.
Yeah.
So can we get into the details of anarchy?
Yeah. Okay. So just like in the real world, we have political and socioeconomic, organizations, that exist and, have specific agendas. In Faerun, the world of D&D, there's, an established canon for what are called factions, which are non-governmental, non-local, more international
clubs.
Yeah, clubs or associations that center around more of an ideological philosophy or perspective, if you will, conscious perspective on the world and what's right and what's wrong. And these factions work as kind of like a deep state kind of as far as like the way the surface politics of Faerun work. Sure. Some of them have very significant like natural environmental protection sanctuary kind of almost Greenpeace-y kind of vibes. Some of them have a more, scholarly, trying to rule with reason kind of a vibe. But the bottom line is that all of these factions, which, like I said, Princes of the Apocalypse book goes into greater detail about how to incorporate factions into your campaign. All of these campaigns are nonetheless fighting for dominance of the culture of Faerun, which is where the door for anarchy opens.
Now, so I think it's also possible to interpret some of those factions, if not all of them, as anarchist factions if you want to interpret them that way. For instance, the Black Market of Zentrim, which I know we've used in our campaigns, their main deal is they deal in black market products, right? They sell magical items that you really shouldn't be able to get your hands on, etc. But you could interpret them as maybe people who are really idealistic about the freedom of product use.
Yeah, kind of like Electronic Freedom Foundation or like digital anarchists.
Yeah, regulation.
Yeah.
Intellectual property, actual property should not be regulated. And maybe that's how they think. And therefore, if you join the Black Market of Zentrim, you're fighting for an anarchist cause.
Yeah. Or like the Emerald Enclave, for example, could be considered like an environmental green anarchist kind of block that is, trying to preserve the natural order and the natural world by fighting against the, industrial consumeristic culture,
Yeah. On that tip, we could also say that you could create alternate factions, right?
Yeah,
that don't exist.
The way that I would probably go about it if I were world building for like a punk rock or anarchistic, flavor to my D&D session, I would consider kind of incorporating an anti-faction, that, for those who don't want to commit themselves to some kind of purpose of conquest, more like a purpose of like going against conquest. Okay. And within this anti-banner, you might call it, would exist many sub-factions. And that, just in the way that in real life, there's a whole spectrum of ideologies in what people consider to be anarchist.
Yeah.
But if I would start, if I were trying to create this world, by painting this picture of an anti-faction faction. So it doesn't have necessarily the global domination, political domination agenda, but offers some of the same mechanics that factions offer in the D&D world.
Okay.
Like there are signifiers and known connections within the world that are your connection points to the faction and the intrigue involved, in the subtext of your campaign with the faction. But within this anarchist banner, let's say it's the banner of the Black Rose or something, maybe everybody in this world has some kind of a black or red like armband or kerchief or something, or a little enamel pin, that communicates to others within the banner of the Black Rose that they are of that mentality.
Sure.
But just like in real life, this anarchistic anti faction, if you will, could be divided along a spectrum with three poles. One that's got a socio-political focus, if you could consider something like the industrial workers of the world, kind of like this almost a trade union-esque perspective on anarchy, versus like kind of a more philosophically oriented anarchy, which is, one of, relativism and, just like focus on, like human progress and decentralization and like
humanitarianism.
More of a humanitarian, individualistic, maybe you might call it a responsible hedonism, or something like that,
Right.
Or, maybe on the third pole be ideological anarchists, think like Black Bloc protest riot groups, people who are like
Those
overtly anti-establishment, extreme in their beliefs,
willing to use violence.
Yeah.
Aggressors
that are out there actively organizing against the local government or the regional government. Yeah,
militant. Okay. Yeah.
And even though,
and who I guess my next question in that scenario would be, who are the enemies of these anarchists?
Well, and that's the great thing, is there are so many hierarchical structures vying for dominance within Faerun, and actually the multiple planes surrounding the material plane, it's rife for creating little niche organizations, and that's why it's so cool.
Like localized, highly localized anarchism.
Think of like, just like maybe some of you experienced this growing up. Like when I was in high school, I had my punk gang, and we had our own naive political social beliefs that we all adhered to. And, someone could point us out as punks, but we didn't necessarily listen to the same exact music that the next gang of punks in the next neighborhood over was like, you know? And they might be more like skinhead punks, you know, very anti-racist, you know?
That was another thing I was thinking about, actually, as you brought that up, is that we also have a world that is highly xenophobic, right? You know, there's a class system, there's a caste system.
I see where you're going with this. It is totally imaginable. Yeah, it's totally imaginable for a particular cell of this anarchist anti-faction to view things like magic and supernatural beings as being like in direct opposition to equality amongst humans.
Sure,
you know?
Anything that propels, you know, maybe an anarchist in this world thinks that something like magic is unfair.
Yeah, because it
creates
makes
a caste
inferior,
system.
but non-magic. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that could be a cool way of infusing political intrigue amongst your heroes, because I would imagine that most of us, you know, who are maybe a little bit more reasonable in our personal philosophies, you know, we'd want to play the part of the punk gang that was racially inclusive, open-minded, and progressive, right?
Sure.
But we might be confronted in our collective Rage Against the Machine to have to maybe decide whether or not we were going to align ourselves with, you know...
Are we going to have a Star Trek conundrum?
Yeah, it's highly possible.
In this world, something else is socially fair, and therefore are we imposing our own personal beliefs when we try to invade their beliefs and make it more socially just under our own concept of social justice? You can really have scenarios like that.
Well, the notion of equality especially is interpreted very differently in different philosophies of anarchy, and because there's such a diverse spectrum of races and power levels in the D&D system, that there is a lot of gray area as far as what's right, what's wrong, what is dominant, what is inferior, you know.
You're bringing to mind the last time I DM'd our group followed one of our great nemesises, the Green Sorcerer, into the Shadow Realm, and ultimately found that he had sworn his allegiance or was making deals with or working for a great lich, and we battled this lich. But it turned out that this lich didn't believe in class or race. And so he was actually using evil sorcerers to do his bidding for him, to bring him highly powered people of different races. And he was trying to breed these babies so he could get rid of race entirely and make a new race, a master race, right? Because he believed the world was being destroyed by war between races. In which scenario was that lich a good guy or a bad guy? It was a difficult quandary, right, to deal with, because he was kidnapping, he was murdering, he was killing, he was an evil lich.
Yeah, to me that sounds more like New World Order style like megalomaniac, like deceptive, benevolent authoritarian, you know?
Yeah, it was fueled with anarchism, right?
Fueled with a benevolence.
Fueled with a benevolent anarchism. He saw the xenophobia and the problems within fighting governments in his world, and he wanted to change that by unifying everyone. But in doing so, he became megalomaniacal, and he became a Hitler figure in wanting to create a singular race that could dominate for world peace.
But even now, you're demonstrating that like there are all different veins of what could be considered anarchy.
Exactly. And that's my point, is that anarchy can exist in this world, but there are many, many aspects of it, many ways to go about it, right?
So, one, some specific plot hooks, talking about the anti-faction of anarchy in Faerun, being comprised of like a lot of different localized groups. You could think of that as being like little splinter cells, and maybe some of them go off on a very zealous ideological path and decide to go into some kind of terroristic kind of a thing. And whereas the maybe less extreme player characters involved in this anti-faction are in a unique position to have advanced knowledge of some actions, and then have to kind of traverse the gray area about how to maintain allegiance to their ideological goals and their faction under the banner of the Black Rose, but without compromising their own morality by letting these terroristic actions happen for the greater good.
Yeah, well, I think if nothing else, we have definitely proved today that anarchy can exist within the world of D&D.
Exist in the world of D&D.
It's a great way to move your campaign along. A lot of campaigns get kind of you get dragged along through receiving an invitation from somewhere, or you have
damsel in distress,
the princess is missing, that sort of thing. But what if it's more political than that?
Yeah.
What if anarchy gets involved? And I think that's whether or not your adventurers are anarchists or not, I think it's a great way to move the plot forward.
Or even just a way to introduce some memorable characters.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think we've drilled that into the ground. Anarchy is in D&D. It's possible. Do it. It's a great idea. And that's it. So if you have any ideas for how anarchy can come into play in D&D, I would love to hear it. If not, only just to utilize it in my own campaigns. So please leave comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Psychedelic Cherry. I'm May McDonough. This is Rusty, and this has been Garage Quest. that's when you have to make really tough decisions as a group, and that can really enhance your gameplay.
Yeah. So that's like maybe more from like a DM and world building perspective, you know, how to infuse anarchy into the just like the epic levels of your game. But there are also ways of just incorporating them in little one-offs or you know, just little vignettes, you know, with certain NPC encounters or whatever.
Brasky, stop it.
You might want to look to your favorite sources of media, like film or books or whatever, to get some inspiration on how to bring just tiny instances of anarchy into your encounters and sessions.
You got an example of that?
Yeah, actually. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of the documentary trilogy, The Decline of Western Civilization.
I have not.
Okay. Well, so it's about the music and subculture in LA in the, you know, late 70s, early 80s. Parts 1 and parts 3 cover specifically the punk rock scene in LA. Part 2 is more about like the metal and glam bands kind of thing. But
okay.
Part 3 in particular really, really like shows what it was like to be a gutter punk. Okay. You know, in the original sense, you know, living in urban decay and you know, being almost completely disconnected from the social order, you know. And that, I think, is a really good place to start if you're going for like a gritty realism in your game in your gameplay, or if you want to introduce a really memorable set of characters that you encounter in like maybe a city adventure for your group.
Maybe a group of NPCs that you run into when you enter a village or a city, and they kind of give you the lowdown on what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. Is that what
you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
And you might even look at some other like biopics, like Sid and Nancy, about the life of Sid Vicious. Well, not the life, but specifically his relationship with Nancy. What's her name? But just,
I think she officially just goes by Nancy now.
Yeah, they're both dead.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm aware of how that story ends.
But just as the whole way of how, like, you know, somewhat empathetic characters might draw your player characters into a world of shit, you know, because, you know, there is some truth or some beauty to like their self-destructiveness, you know. Or What We Do in Secret, which is about the germs. The story of Crash Darby and their whole mysterious 5-year plan and everything. Yeah, like that you could get.
Our dog is terrorizing the room. Brasky, come here. This is Bill Brasky. Come here. You come here. Go ahead.
But it doesn't have to be dark, you know, like all that involving heroin and suicide.
Punk rock doesn't have to be dark.
No, in fact,
garage rock doesn't have to be dark.
Two of my favorite characters from punk rock fiction, Steve-O and Heroin Bob from SLC Punk.
We just said it didn't have to be dark.
Well, Heroin Bob's character, that's an ironic name.
It is. He doesn't do heroin. But doesn't Steve-O die?
No, Bob dies.
Oh, Bob dies. That's right.
Because of he gets an infection in his hand and then takes a bunch of pills. And, you know, anyway.
And he's never done them before.
Yeah. But that duo, that like classic punk rock duo of like the really wild, like out of control guy and like the really like deep brooding philosophical guy, you know, that are both in it together against everyone else, you know, and the whole notion of their gang and how, you know, if you can imagine it in Faerun, that these guys, Steve-O and Bob, are just, you know, they're just vagabonds in the world, just traveling the world, shooting the shit with other outcasts. But whenever they run across these fucking rednecks or the, you know, these soldiers of the nobility or whatever, they gotta start a fight with them. Yeah. You know, and it's just like this epic brawl, or, you know.
Yeah. It's a matter of ethos at that point.
Yeah. Or even just looking at, like, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Slacker. Just like, it's just a series of vignettes of all of these punk rock people, these degenerate punk rock people in the suburban wasteland, you know, like if you can imagine retweaking the Pap Smear girl. Yeah. The one who's trying to sell Madonna's Pap Smear. Yeah. You know, like, you know, maybe there's like a local celebrity or a local, like, you know, whatever that,
just,
you know,
trying to make a buck.
She's got the menstrual rag of that celebrity or, you know.
Of Roscoe Goodbarrel.
Yeah, something like that.
I guess a menstrual rag would be a weird thing.
It would be quite a scandalous story if Roscoe Goodbarrel were to need a menstrual
rag for some terrible reason.
Yeah. Or even just like the little vignette where the old friendly anarchist gets, like, you know, is a victim of a robber, you know, and they end up just like chopping it up and becoming friends, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
So like, just like, you know, just like infusing this little bit of a quirky side of anarchy and punk rock into the storyline through these little tiny encounters, you know. Yeah.
I think that's great. I think that that really shows what personalities can construe with their anarchist ideals. What do you think about how that would affect a party in general, an adventuring party? What if some of the party is not anarchist and some of the party is?
Well, I would say again, just try to mirror real life, you know, because, you know, everyone's been in that situation where, you know, they're intimately close with people who don't share the same philosophical agenda, say.
Sure.
You know, a lot of us typically avoid talking about politics or controversial subjects around the people that we love, for the sake of keeping peace. And I think that would more or less be the center of the hilarity in the group, you know?
Yeah.
Because I could definitely imagine a highly devout cleric character being very much about the established order of his, you know, of his or her religious order, and the light that it provides in the darkness, the cruel darkness of the world, you know.
And that's definitely one point that I'm taking with me is in Faerun, anarchy and atheism are essentially the same thing, because gods actually exist in the world of D&D, right? So
well, I'd certainly say
allegiance is allegiance, no matter to who.
Right? I wouldn't
patriotism.
I wouldn't say that they're necessarily one and the same, because I think that it's possible to, even in this world, to be an anarchist and be religious.
Absolutely, in this world.
Yeah, but in the vein of the very dogmatic, no gods, no masters, you know, camp of anarchy, there are a couple different ways I could see that playing out in a world where there is a thing called a god. Like people see it and know that it's real. You know, not just conjecture, but we have physical proof that this exists. There are a couple ways to go about it. One is that the anarchistic characters, player characters or non-player characters, can falsely believe that gods don't exist. So they can actually be the ones that are wrong.
They would have to be extremely ignorant and sheltered.
Is that not possible in our world? Isn't that how a lot of atheists perceive those who are religious in our world? Because there is no physical proof?
True, but mass hysteria is a thing.
Yeah, and what's to say that in a world with actual physical things that are quote-unquote gods,
yeah,
who's to say that a mass hysteria that wouldn't exist that is counter to that belief?
Sure.
So you could play it off like that. It's like people who are just so willfully ignorant of the existence of like godlike supernatural beings.
Sure.
Or you can
that would be true atheism, but not necessarily require anarchy. When you could have the opposite, which is to believe that they exist, but to have absolutely no faith in them.
Exactly.
To believe that perhaps they're detrimental to the world, in which case you would not necessarily be atheist, but you would be anarchist.
Certainly. That is one interpretation of it. Another interpretation in that vein is that there are these things that people call gods, but they're actually just more highly evolved versions of more mundane creatures.
Yeah.
And that they are wrongfully positing themselves at the top of a spiritual hierarchy.
Yeah, in which case they're just masters.
Yes.
Right. More powerful masters.
And then there's even another one where it's more of a anti-disestablishmentarian anarchism, which is
$20 word.
Yeah. That there exists this thing called gods who shaped reality and created these mortal beings, but that the mortal beings are the true owners of reality, and the only way for them to be in an egalitarian anarchistic utopia is to rid the world of gods. So then the anarchist becomes the vampire slayer, the god killer, the
slave freer.
Alternately, if you are a supernatural being, you might see him as a persecutor. If you're a mortal being, you might see him as a liberator.
Cut the ties that bind.
Yeah.
Free the tether. So,
anyway, it's rife. It is rife with all kinds of existential, personal, group dynamics.
I think if nothing else, we have proven today that it's absolutely possible to have anarchy in the world of D&D.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, if it's not already a part of your campaign setting, you should consider incorporating it in at least some small way, if not just for aesthetic purposes, for narrative purposes.
Yeah, it's a great way to drive plot. Yeah.
And intrigue.
Like
and add realism, because even in our own world,
I think people do tend to maneuver their campaigns around something goes missing, something is stolen, somebody comes and asks for help. These really generic ways to entice you into an adventure, right? But political intrigue is a great way to go about moving the characters into different scenarios, and dealing with anarchism is a really great catalyst for that. So
I agree.
All right. Well, I think we I think that we tore that one up, though.
Yeah.
We cannot talk more about it. We could, but we shouldn't.
Yeah. I do have more notes, but yeah, we'll cut it.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been Garage Quest, talking about anarchy and D&D. Don't forget to subscribe to the Psychedelic Cherry, and we will see you next time. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. And you can put your own ideas.
Oh, yeah. Leave little comments if you have any more ideas about how to put anarchy into your D&D campaign. Thanks. Okay, let's check and make sure everything... Yeah.